Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the misty bamboo forests and rigid social hierarchies of feudal Japan. Behind those elegant silk screens and cherry blossoms lies a world of surprising brutality that would shatter a modern person within hours. From bewildering etiquette rules where a single mistake could cost your life, to parasitic diseases lurking in every rice paddy, samurai warriors who could execute commoners on a whim, to medical practices that would make your skin crawl. Your modern sensibilities and habits simply aren't equipped for life under the Shogunate. Before we begin our journey through the less romanticized aspects of feudal Japan, if you enjoy these nighttime stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community of history lovers. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always wonderful to see our global family connecting through these stories. Now go ahead and dim those lights. Perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soothing background noise, and settle in as we drift back together to a time when surviving beneath the shadow of Mount Fuji required skills and tolerances you simply don't possess. Let's begin our journey in the world of feudal Japan, specifically during the Edo period, around the late 1700s. This era represents what many consider the classic period of Japanese feudalism, when social structures were most rigidly defined and the isolation policy of Sakoku kept Japan largely cut off from Western influence. Imagine for a moment that you've suddenly been transported from your comfortable modern existence to a small village outside Edo or what would later become Tokyo. The first thing that would hit you would be the smell. A complex mixture of wood smoke, fermented soybeans, human waste used as fertilizer in nearby fields, and the earthy dampness of rice paddies. Nothing in your modern experience has prepared your nose for this olfactory assault, and you'd likely find yourself gagging before you've even begun to take in your visual surroundings. As you struggle to adjust, you'd quickly notice another immediate problem. You stand out catastrophically. If you're of non-Japanese descent, your appearance alone would cause absolute chaos in a society where foreigners were essentially banned and could be killed on sight in many areas. But even if you're of Japanese heritage, everything about you would immediately mark you as dangerously foreignize. Your posture, your haircut, your mannerisms, even the way you make eye contact would signal to everyone around you that you don't belong. And in feudal Japan, not belonging wasn't just a social inconvenience. It could be a death sentence. Let's talk about the social structure that would immediately confine and define you. Feudal Japanese society operated under the strict Shino-kosho system, a rigid class hierarchy where everyone knew their place, and stepping outside it could result in severe punishment. At the top sat the samurai warrior class, making up about 10% of the population. Below them were the farmers and peasants, then artisans, and at the bottom, merchants. Below even these were the Eida and Hinin Turstuni untouchables, who handled death and unclean things, so polluted in the social understanding that they weren't even considered part of humanity. The moment you arrived, you would be categorized, and without proper documentation, clothing, language skills, and behavioral knowledge, you'd likely end up as either an outlaw or relegated to the lowest possible status. Without family connections or a recognized position in the social hierarchy, you would essentially have no rights and no protection. The authorities might even suspect you of being a Christian missionary, a capital offense during most of the Edo period. Let's imagine, though, that through some stroke of luck, you're taken in by a farming family who decide not to immediately report you to the authorities. Perhaps they mistake you for someone suffering from memory loss, or perhaps they're unusually kind and curious. Even in this best-case scenario, your survival challenges are just beginning. The first practical problem you'd face is communication. While you might have picked up some Japanese phrases from modern anime or travel, the language spoken in feudal Japan would be largely incomprehensible to you. The vocabulary, grammar, honorifics, and even pronunciation were significantly different from modern Japanese. More importantly, language in feudal Japan wasn't just about communication, it was about maintaining social hierarchy. Every sentence required careful consideration of the social status of both speaker and listener, with different verb forms, pronouns, and honorifics used depending on who was addressing whom. Say the wrong word, or use the incorrect level of formality, and you could cause serious offense. Address a samurai with insufficient respect, and you might find yourself facing the dreaded Kirisuit Gomen, the samurai's legal right to strike down commoners who showed disrespect. This wasn't a rare occurrence. Historical records show numerous instances of samurai testing their new swords on peasants who failed to bow properly or spoke out of turn. Even if you managed to avoid offending anyone with your speech, your body language would betray you constantly. Modern people tend to stand straight, make direct eye contact when speaking, and gesticulate freely, all behaviors that would be read as aggressive, disrespectful, or bizarre in feudal Japan. The proper way to stand in the presence of superiors was with eyes downcast, back bent slightly forward, hands at sides or folded properly. The depth and duration of your bow would need to precisely match your social status relative to the person you're greeting. Get this wrong, and at best you'd be seen as mentally disturbed, at worst deliberately provocative. Now let's talk about daily survival. The first shock to your system would be the food. The staple diet for most people in Edo, Japan, consisted mainly of rice, pickled vegetables, small amounts of fish, and miso soup. Meat was rare. Dairy products virtually non-existent. If you're used to a modern diet rich in protein, sugar, and processed foods, your body would struggle to adjust. Many modern people would experience significant hunger on this diet, along with digestive distress, as your system adapted to unfamiliar bacteria and fermented foods. But the real danger wouldn't be hunger. It would be what lurked in the food and water. Feudal Japan had no concept of germ theory, no water treatment facilities, and minimal food safety practices. Water was frequently contaminated with bacteria that caused dysentery, typhoid, and other diseases that could kill within days. Parasitic infections were extremely common. Roundworms, hookworms, and liver flukes thrived in the water-soaked environment of rice farming communities. Within weeks, you'd likely be hosting a variety of intestinal parasites that would further compromise your already stressed nutrition. The particularly nasty threat would come from rice paddies themselves. Schistosomiasis, a disease caused by parasitic worms that penetrate the skin on contact with infected water, was endemic in rice farming regions. These parasites would enter through your feet as you helped in the paddies, which would be expected if you were living with a farming family, migrate to your blood vessels, and eventually cause liver damage, intestinal disease, and potentially death. Without modern medicine, even minor injuries or infections could quickly become life-threatening. Cut yourself on a farming implement, and without antibiotics, the wound could easily become infected in the warm, humid climate. A simple case of food poisoning could lead to deadly dehydration. Dental problems, which would almost certainly develop without modern dental care, could lead to abscesses and systemic infections. The medical treatments available would likely strike you as worse than the diseases they were meant to treat. Medical practice in feudal Japan combined Chinese-influenced concepts like balancing opposing forces in the body with local herbalism and spiritual healing. While some herbal remedies did contain effective medicinal compounds, many treatments involved painful procedures with limited effectiveness. Need surgery. Hope you enjoy being fully conscious while a surgeon cuts into you without anesthesia or antiseptics. Got a fever? You might be treated with acupuncture, moxibustion, burning herbs on your skin, or bloodletting. Suffering from parasites. Your treatment might involve toxic herbs that were almost as dangerous as the infestation. Had a stroke or seizure. You might have holes drilled in your skull to release the evil spirits. Now let's talk about shelter and daily life. If you're staying with that hypothetical farming family, you'd be living in conditions that would test your physical and psychological endurance. The typical farmhouse was a simple structure, with earthen floors, paper windows, and thatched roofs. In winter, the only heat would come from a small arroy hearth in the central room, leaving the air smoky and the temperature frigid in outlying rooms. In summer, the house would be stiflingly hot and humid, with no relief from the swarms of mosquitoes that brought malaria and Japanese encephalitis. Privacy as you understand, it wouldn't exist. You'd sleep on a thin futon, laid directly on the floor, possibly sharing the room with the entire family. Bathing would be an infrequent communal activity, and the toilet would be a simple pit or bucket, its contents destined for the fields as fertilizer. Toilet paper, forget about it. A wooden stick or water would be your options for cleaning yourself. Your daily schedule would be dictated by the sun and the agricultural calendar. During planting and harvest seasons, you'd work from dawn to dusk in the fields, performing backbreaking labor with primitive tools. Rice farming in particular was extraordinarily labor-intensive, requiring you to spend hours bent over in knee-deep water, planting or harvesting by hand. Your modern body, unused to such sustained physical labor, would scream in protest. Blisters would form and break on your hands. Your back would spasm from the unaccustomed posture. And this assumes you're healthy enough to work. Which brings us to another critical challenge, your immune system. Having grown up in a modern environment with different pathogens, your body would have no defense against the local disease strains. The concept of disease in feudal Japan differed greatly from our modern understanding as well. Many illnesses were attributed to spiritual imbalances, evil spirits, or moral failings, rather than bacteria or viruses. Epidemics regularly swept through communities, with smallpox, cholera, and influenza claiming countless lives. Without vaccination or modern treatments, these diseases were often death sentences. Even if you managed to avoid the major killers, chronic conditions like tuberculosis were widespread, and parasitic infections were nearly universal among the farming class. The psychological stress would be as challenging as the physical hardships. You'd find yourself in a world where many behaviors you take for granted would be forbidden, while new rules you don't understand would govern every interaction. Women in particular would face additional restrictions, expected to show absolute obedience to fathers, husbands, and even sons, with few rights and many responsibilities. Think about simple daily activities you perform without thinking. In feudal Japan, there would be precise, proper ways to eat, drink, sit, address others, enter a room, even sleep, and knowing these unwritten rules would be essential to your survival. Imagine trying to navigate a world where you don't know how to properly hold chopsticks, don't understand when to bow or how deeply, can't read any signs or documents, and aren't familiar with the complex web of obligations and relationships that govern every interaction. Even time itself would be alien to you. The Japanese temporal system divided the day into 6 units rather than 24 hours, with flexible periods that varied with the seasons. There were no weekends as you understand them, though there were periodic market days and festivals that provided some breaks from labor. Your entire concept of when things should happen would need to be rewritten. Let's talk about clothing, another area where you'd immediately stand out. Traditional Japanese clothing involved multiple layers with specific ways of wrapping and tying. Women's kimonos were particularly complex, requiring knowledge of numerous rules about color combinations, sleeve length, and pattern choice that indicated age, marital status, and social position. Even if given proper clothing, you'd likely put it on incorrectly, tie it the wrong way, or violate seasonal color conventions without realizing it. For men, the hairstyle alone would mark you as an outsider. The traditional chamage, with the top of the head shaved and remaining hair oiled and tied in a top knot, was the norm for most men. Your modern haircut would immediately signal that you didn't belong, potentially marking you as a criminal or outcast. Now let's consider your legal standing, or lack thereof. Feudal Japan operated under a complex legal system, where punishment was harsh and justice often arbitrary. Without proper documentation, proving your place in society, you would have essentially no legal rights. Crimes were often punished collectively, with entire families or villages held responsible for the actions of individuals. The concept of collective responsibility, Renza, meant that if you caused trouble, everyone who had associated with you could be punished as well. This meant that even if that farming family took you in initially, the risk you posed to them would likely become too great over time. Your ignorance of customs, language, and behavior would eventually bring unwanted attention, potentially endangering your hosts. Their most logical action would be to turn you over to authorities before you could cause them harm. And what would those authorities do with you? As an unknown person with no identifiable place in the social order, no documentation, and strange mannerisms, you would likely be treated as an outlaw at best or a foreign spy at worst. Punishment for either could range from imprisonment to execution, with torture commonly used to extract confessions. Speaking of enforcement, let's discuss the samurai, the warrior class that served as both military and police in feudal Japan. While popular culture has romanticized samurai as noble warriors following a strict code of honor, the reality for commoners was that samurai represented a constant threat of arbitrary violence. The right of Kirisuit Gomen mentioned earlier was very real. Neither class samurai could legally kill commoners for perceived insults with minimal consequences. Historical records document cases of samurai decapitating peasants to test a new sword's sharpness, executing commoners for failing to bow properly, or killing servants who displeased them in minor ways. While not all samurai abused their power to this extent, the legal structure gave them the ability to do so with impunity. As an outsider without protection, you would be particularly vulnerable to such treatment. Even nature itself would seem to conspire against your survival. Japan's geography creates conditions for frequent natural disasters. Earthquakes, tsunami, volcanic eruptions, and typhoons regularly devastated communities during the Edo period. Without modern construction techniques, early warning systems, or disaster management, these events were far deadlier than their modern counterparts. The Great Ansi earthquake of 1855, for example, destroyed over 14,000 buildings in Edo and killed thousands. Imagine trying to survive such a disaster without emergency services, modern communication, or disaster relief programs. The aftermath often brought disease outbreaks and food shortages that claimed even more lives than the initial disaster. And we haven't even discussed the wildlife. While Japan lacks many of the large predators found elsewhere, it is home to venomous snakes like the mamushi pit viper, giant hornets whose sting can be fatal, and numerous poisonous plants that a foreigner wouldn't recognize. Without modern medical treatment, a single unfortunate encounter with these natural hazards could prove fatal. By now, you're probably wondering if there's any way you could possibly survive in this environment. The truth is, your odds would be extraordinarily low. Without the lifetime of training in social norms, language, practical skills, and physical conditioning that natives received from birth, you'd be operating at a crippling disadvantage. Your modern knowledge might seem valuable, but much of it would be useless without the technological infrastructure to implement it, and attempting to introduce radical new ideas would more likely get you branded as insane or subversive than hailed as a visionary. The most telling evidence of how difficult it would be comes from the few historical cases of foreigners who actually did find themselves in feudal Japan during its period of isolation. The experiences of shipwrecked sailors and the handful of Western traders permitted in the isolated port of Dejima demonstrate that even with organizational support and interpreters, navigating Japanese society was extraordinarily challenging for outsiders. Many who were shipwrecked died from exposure, starvation, or execution before they could adapt. As our first part of this exploration comes to a close, we've only scratched the surface of the challenges that would face a modern person transported to feudal Japan. In our next section, we'll delve deeper into the psychological aspects of this experience, how your modern mind would struggle to comprehend a worldview fundamentally different from your own, where concepts like individual rights, equality, and personal fulfillment were subordinated to collective harmony, proper hierarchy, and duty. We'll also explore specific aspects of daily life in more detail, mithers from the foods you'd struggle to digest to the household tasks you wouldn't know how to perform. We'll look at the seasonal cycles that governed life, the religious practices you'd be expected to participate in without understanding, and the complex web of obligations that would bind you to others in ways modern individualism has largely abandoned. For now, close your eyes and imagine the sensory reality of that world: the smell of wood smoke and fermenting soybeans, the sound of rainfall on thatched roofs, the feel of rough hemp cloth against your skin, the taste of plain rice and pickled vegetables day after day. In many ways, the physical hardships might be easier to endure than the social isolation and constant anxiety of navigating a world whose rules you fundamentally don't understand, where a single misstep could cost not just your life, but the lives of anyone who tried to help you. As we continue our exploration of why you wouldn't survive in feudal Japan, let's delve deeper into the psychological and cultural barriers that would make adaptation nearly impossible. Even if you somehow manage to overcome the immediate physical threats we discussed in the first part, the mental and emotional challenges might prove even more insurmountable. Let's start with your fundamental worldview. Modern society, regardless of which country you come from, generally emphasizes individualism, personal rights, equality, and self-determination. These concepts would be not just foreign but potentially dangerous in feudal Japan, where the collective always took precedence over the individual. Hierarchy was considered the natural order of the universe, and one's duty to family and lord superseded personal desires. The concept of household or family lineage formed the basic unit of society rather than the individual. Your identity would be inseparable from your role within your household and that household's position within the broader social structure. The notion that you might have personal goals distinct from your family's expectations would be seen as selfish and disruptive to social harmony. This extends to the concept of obligation and giri duty, which governed all social interactions. Every kindness received created an obligation to repay it, often with interest. These complex webs of reciprocal obligation bound Japanese society together, but would be largely invisible to you until you violated them. Imagine living in a world where you're constantly accumulating social debts you don't recognize, can't track, and don't know how to repay. Each day would bring new opportunities to offend others by failing to acknowledge or discharge obligations you didn't even know you had. Even your emotional landscape would be alien in feudal Japan. Modern psychology encourages emotional awareness and expression, but traditional Japanese society valued emotional restraint above almost all else. The concept of true feelings versus taitme public behavior meant that one's true emotions were rarely displayed openly. Showing anger, frustration, or even excessive happiness in public would mark you as emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous. Your concept of personal space would also cause constant friction. Modern Western cultures typically maintain a physical distance of 2 meters 4 feet in social interactions, but traditional Japanese society had different spatial norms. In some contexts, such as crowded living quarters or public baths, physical proximity would be much closer than you're comfortable with. In other situations, particularly formal ones, you'd be expected to maintain precisely calculated distances based on social rank, knowledge you wouldn't possess. The concept of time would further disorient you. Beyond the different methods of timekeeping mentioned earlier, the entire rhythm of life moved according to natural cycles and agricultural necessities, rather than fixed schedules. The idea that certain activities must happen at precise times regardless of conditions would seem rigid and unnatural to your hosts. Conversely, the flexible approach to timing common in feudal Japan might strike you as chaotic or undisciplined. Let's explore the religious and philosophical landscape you'd encounter, which would further complicate your adaptation. Feudal Japan practiced a complex blend of Shinto, Buddhism, and Confucianism, with elements of folk religion woven throughout daily life. Rather than separate religious practices from secular activities, spiritual beliefs permeated every aspect of existence. You would be expected to participate in household rituals honoring ancestors, local shrine festivals, and Buddhist observances without necessarily understanding their significance. Refusing to participate wouldn't just be seen as religious dissent itself problematic, but as a rejection of community and family obligations. Even simple daily activities like cooking rice, entering a house, or beginning work had associated rituals and proper ways of behaving that held spiritual significance. The concept of purity and pollution kager would be particularly difficult to grasp yet was fundamental to daily life. Certain conditions, occupations, and activities were considered spiritually polluting in death, blood, childbirth, butchery, and leatherworking among them. Those who handled polluting substances or performed such work were themselves considered polluted, hence the untouchable status of Eta and Hinin castes. As a modern person used to scientific explanations for natural phenomena, you might inadvertently offend by treating sacred objects casually or entering prohibited spaces without proper purification. Your potential dismissal of important spiritual beliefs would quickly alienate you from the community whose acceptance you desperately need for survival. The gender roles and expectations would be another significant shock, particularly if you're a woman. Feudal Japan maintained strictly defined gender roles governed by Confucian principles. Women were subject to the three obediences, minutses, obedience to father in childhood, husband in marriage, and son in old age. A woman's primary purpose was considered to be household management, childbearing, and supporting her husband's family line. Female education focused on domestic skills, proper deportment, and moral cultivation rather than academic learning. Women had extremely limited property rights, restricted mobility outside the home, and little say in major life decisions such as marriage. Even their clothing and appearance were heavily regulated, with married women expected to blacken their teeth, ohaguro, and shave their eyebrows as signs of their status. If you're a modern woman, these restrictions would feel suffocating. Attempting to assert independence, speak to men as equals, or perform activities considered masculine would bring swift censure and potentially serious consequences. Even your body language, making direct eye contact, standing tall, speaking loudly, would mark you as inappropriate and possibly mentally unstable. For modern men, the challenges would be different, but no less significant. You would be expected to demonstrate stoicism, emotional restraint, and unquestioning loyalty to superiors. Physical displays of affection, emotional vulnerability, or hesitation in following orders would be seen as weakness. The concept of masculinity was tightly bound to one's ability to fulfill social obligations and maintain proper relationships within the hierarchy, not individual achievements or personal expression. Let's talk about education and knowledge, mates, areas where your modern background might seem advantageous, but would more likely create additional barriers. Literacy in feudal Japan was relatively high compared to contemporary Western societies, but this meant mastery of a complex writing system used primarily for classical texts, government documents, and commercial records. The writing system combined kanji, Chinese characters, hiragana, and katakana, requiring years of study to master. Even if you know modern Japanese, the classical language used in documents would be largely incomprehensible to you. Your modern scientific knowledge would be simultaneously advanced and useless. Attempting to explain germ theory, electricity, or other scientific concepts would likely be met with confusion or suspicion. Without the technological infrastructure to demonstrate these principles, your advanced knowledge would seem like either madness or dangerous foreign mysticism. In a society where stability was valued above innovation, proposing radical new ideas could mark you as a disruptive influence. The concept of medicine deserves deeper exploration, as health challenges would be among your most immediate concerns. Medical practices in feudal Japan combined elements of traditional Chinese medicine with local herbal knowledge and spiritual healing. Disease was understood primarily through the framework of balancing opposing forces in the body rather than fighting external pathogens. Common treatments included acupuncture, moxibustion, burning herbs on the skin, herbal remedies, and manipulation of pressure points. While some of these approaches had genuine therapeutic value for certain conditions, they would be woefully inadequate for treating bacterial infections, traumatic injuries, or many chronic diseases. Your body, accustomed to modern medical interventions, might struggle to fight off infections that local immune systems had adapted to over generations. Mental health issues would be particularly challenging. Conditions we now recognize as depression, anxiety, or PTSD would be interpreted through entirely different frameworks, often with spiritual or moral dimensions. The psychological stress of your situation, cultural dislocation, constant fear, inability to communicate effectively would likely manifest physical symptoms, yet the treatments available might worsen your condition rather than improve it. Let's examine daily activities in more detail to understand just how unprepared you would be. Consider the seemingly simple act of eating. In feudal Japan, meals followed strict protocols regarding serving order, proper handling of chopsticks, appropriate comments to the cook, and even the direction one should face while eating particular foods on certain occasions. Specific foods were associated with particular seasons, festivals, or social classes, and eating the wrong food at the wrong time could be seen as presumptuous or ignorant. The typical diet would challenge your modern palate and digestive system. The staple was plain white rice, with small side dishes of pickled vegetables, occasionally small amounts of fish, and miso soup. Meat was rare, as Buddhist principles discouraged killing animals for food, though this prohibition relaxed somewhat during the Edo period. Sugar was an expensive luxury, as were most spices. Meals were typically bland by modern standards, though fermented foods like natto, fermented soybeans, and various pickles provided strong flavors that many modern people find difficult to appreciate. Personal hygiene would present another set of challenges. While Japanese culture valued cleanliness, the practices were very different from modern norms. Bathing was communal when available, with strict protocols about washing thoroughly outside the bath before entering the shared water. In rural areas, opportunities for full baths might be limited to weekly visits to a public bathhouse or seasonal river bathing. Dental hygiene involved wooden toothpicks and occasionally rice-based cleaning powders, but nothing approaching modern toothbrushes and toothpaste. Combined with a diet increasingly containing rice, which converts to sugar in the mouth during chewing, dental problems were common. Tooth extraction was one of the few treatments available for severe dental issues, performed without anesthesia by specialized practitioners. Waste management was primitive by modern standards. Most rural homes used a simple pit latrine, with human waste collected regularly for use as agricultural fertilizer. In urban areas like Edo, professional waste collectors, known as night soil collectors, would remove waste from urban residences and sell it to farmers in the surrounding countryside. While this system was remarkably efficient for pre-modern waste management, the hygienic standards would be shocking to modern sensibilities. Now let's explore the agricultural cycle that would dominate your life if you found yourself among the farming class, where over 80% of the population belonged. The rice farming calendar structured the entire year. In spring, fields were prepared by plowing with simple wooden or iron-tipped plows, pulled by oxen or horses if the farmer was fortunate enough to own them. More often, human labor did the majority of the work. Seeds were carefully germinated in special nursery beds before transplanting. The early summer brought the labor-intensive process of transplanting rice seedlings by hand. a back-breaking task requiring workers to bend over in knee-deep water for days on end. This was followed by constant vigilance against pests, maintaining proper water levels, and weeding throughout the growing season. Fall brought the harvest, another period of intense labor, as rice had to be cut, dried, threshed, and stored properly to prevent spoilage. Winter was devoted to repair of tools and equipment, handicraft production, and other tasks that couldn't be accomplished during the growing season. This cycle allowed little room for error or rest. Crop failures, due to weather, pests, or disease, could mean starvation for farming families, who were also required to pay significant portions of their harvest as taxes to their feudal lords. Your modern body, unaccustomed to such constant physical labor in challenging conditions, would quickly deteriorate under these demands. The tax system itself deserves mention, as it sharply limited the resources available to common people. Under the Tokugawa Shogunate, farmers typically paid between 40 to 60% of their rice crop as land tax to their feudal lord. This heavy burden meant that even in good years, farming families lived close to subsistence level. Additional taxes and obligations were imposed for special projects, military campaigns, or natural disaster recovery. For townspeople, various taxes on property, businesses, and occupations similarly restricted available resources. The constant struggle to meet these obligations, while maintaining basic survival, would occupy much of your mental and physical energy, leaving little room for anything else. Let's consider some specific occupations and their challenges. If you weren't a farmer, you might find yourself apprenticed to an artisan, through the charity of someone taking pity on your strange situation. Traditional crafts in feudal Japan, pottery, carpentry, metalworking, textile production, required years of apprenticeship under a master. As an apprentice, you would occupy the lowest rung of the household hierarchy, expected to perform menial tasks, learn by observation rather than explicit instruction, and endure harsh discipline as part of your training. The master-apprentice relationship was quasi-familial, with the master having almost total authority over the apprentice's life. Physical punishment for mistakes was common and expected. Many crafts also involved significant physical hazards. Pottery kilns could explode. Metalworking involved risk of burns and toxic metal exposure. Textile dyeing used caustic chemicals. Without modern safety equipment or medical treatment, occupational injuries often led to permanent disability or death. If you found yourself in an urban setting like Edo, Osaka, or Kyoto, you'd face different but equally daunting challenges. Urban population density created public health issues that regularly erupted into epidemics. Fire was a constant threat in cities built primarily of wood and paper. Edo, in particular, was known as the City of Fires, with major conflagrations occurring regularly. Crime was controlled through a combination of strict punishments and collective responsibility, but urban areas still had their dangers, particularly at night, when travel was restricted and streets were largely unlit. Urban occupations included shopkeeping, service in wealthy households, labor in various manufacturing enterprises, or work in the entertainment districts. Each had its own hierarchical structure, specialized knowledge requirements, and physical demands that a modern person would struggle to meet. Even seemingly familiar roles like food vendor or clothing merchant operated under completely different business models, with complex supplier relationships, guild regulations, and customer expectations that would be alien to you. Let's explore a specific scenario that might seem like a potential advantage. What if you possessed a specialized skill from the modern world? Perhaps you're a doctor, engineer, or have some other technical expertise. Wouldn't that make you valuable? Unfortunately, without the supporting infrastructure, most modern technical knowledge would be nearly impossible to apply effectively. A modern doctor, without access to antibiotics, diagnostic equipment, or sterile environments, could offer little improvement over traditional healers. An engineer without standardized materials, precision tools, or mathematical tables would struggle to implement modern designs. More importantly, attempting to introduce radically new ideas or methods would likely be met with suspicion or outright hostility. The Tokugawa shogunate maintained stability partly through strict control of information and resistance to foreign influences. Innovative ideas that threatened established practices were often suppressed, and those who promoted them risked being branded as subversives. Let's talk about crime and punishment, as your unfamiliarity with local laws would put you at high risk of transgression. The justice system in feudal Japan was designed primarily to maintain social order rather than protect individual rights. Punishments were severe, often involving torture, banishment, or execution. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Suspects were typically assumed guilty and expected to confess, with torture commonly used to extract confessions. For serious crimes, punishment often extended beyond the individual to their family or even entire community under the principle of collective responsibility. This meant that any trouble you caused could result in punishment for those associated with you, giving them strong incentive to report suspicious behavior before it implicated them. Investigation of crimes was conducted by magistrates with broad powers and few procedural constraints by modern standards. Physical evidence was considered less important than confession and testimony from witnesses of good standing. As a stranger without social connections or status, your word would carry essentially no weight in any legal proceeding. Even your facial expressions and body language could betray you in ways you wouldn't anticipate. Japanese culture developed highly nuanced awareness of subtle expressions, with certain facial movements considered deeply offensive or suspicious. Your habitual expressions, formed in a completely different cultural context, would likely send unintended signals that could provoke negative reactions. The concept of han and tatame mentioned earlier, this distinction between true inner feelings and socially appropriate expressions. Most interactions in feudal Japan operated on multiple levels, with direct statements often being less important than implied meanings and contextual cues. Without the cultural framework to interpret these subtleties, you would constantly misread situations and respond inappropriately. Let's consider some historical examples that illuminate why adaptation would be so difficult. During Japan's period of isolation, a small number of Westerners did find themselves stranded in Japan through shipwrecks or other misadventures. Their experiences provide sobering insights into the challenges you would face. One notable case is that of John Manjiro, a Japanese fisherman who was shipwrecked and rescued by an American whaling ship in 1841. After living in America for several years, he returned to Japan, despite the risk of execution, as leaving Japan was illegal. Though Manjiro was Japanese by birth, his time abroad had changed him enough that he struggled to reintegrate and faced suspicion and ostracism. If someone born and raised in Japanese culture faced such difficulties after time abroad, imagine how much more challenging it would be for you, with no cultural foundation whatsoever. Another case is that of the Dutch traders confined to Dejima, a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor, and the only place foreigners were legally permitted during the isolation period. Despite having interpreters, official standing, and decades of institutional knowledge about navigating Japanese customs, these traders still frequently found themselves in culturally perilous situations. They were forbidden from learning Japanese too well, prevented from traveling freely, and subject to strict regulations about every aspect of their behavior. Even when Japan began to open to the outside world in the mid-19th century, foreigners faced enormous challenges. The first Western diplomats and merchants operated under constant threat of violence from anti-foreign elements, with several being assassinated despite official protection. Without such official standing, your situation would be infinitely more precarious. Now let's explore some specific cultural practices that would be particularly challenging for a modern person to navigate. Gift giving was an essential social ritual governed by complex rules about what gifts were appropriate for which occasions, how they should be wrapped, presented, received, and acknowledged. The monetary value, symbolic associations, and number of items all carried significance. Giving an inappropriate gift could cause serious offense, while failing to reciprocate appropriately would mark you as uncultured or disrespectful. Seasonal observances structured the year, with each festival requiring specific preparations, foods, decorations, and behaviors. Participation wasn't optional, but an expected community obligation. From New Year celebrations to Obon, honoring ancestors, these events carried deep cultural and spiritual significance that would be largely opaque to you. Household management followed strict protocols about everything from how to arrange items to the proper way to clean specific objects. Women were expected to master hundreds of detailed procedures for maintaining the household according to tradition. Without this knowledge, even simple domestic tasks would mark you as incompetent or improperly raised. All of these challenges assume you're attempting to integrate into society, but realistically, your options might be even more limited. With your strange appearance, behavior, and speech, you might be denied normal social integration altogether. Historical records show that most foreigners who ended up in Japan during the isolation period were either executed, imprisoned, or held under house arrest, while authorities decided their fate. If your physical appearance marked you as obviously foreign, you might be treated as a curiosity by local authorities and potentially sent to Edo for examination by government officials. This would mean a dangerous journey under guard, followed by intense questioning through interpreters, if any could be found for your language. Your inability to explain your origins in a way that made sense in their worldview would likely lead to suspicion of espionage or other nefarious purposes. For women, the situation would be particularly dire. Foreign women in feudal Japan were almost unheard of, and a woman traveling alone or without clear family connections would be regarded with extreme suspicion. The social structures that provided protection for Japanese women family relationships, household position, marriage alliances would be unavailable to you, leaving you extraordinarily vulnerable. As we prepare to move to our next section, consider this: even if you somehow overcame all these barriers and managed to establish a precarious existence in feudal Japan, your psychological well-being would face constant assault. Modern psychology recognizes that complete cultural isolation, being the only person who shares your fundamental assumptions, values, and experiences, creates profound emotional distress. You would live every day knowing that no one around you truly understands you or shares your perspective on the world. This form of cultural solitude, combined with the constant vigilance required to avoid social missteps, would create a level of chronic stress that few modern people have experienced. The mental health implications alone would make long-term survival questionable, even if you manage to meet your basic physical needs. In our next section, we'll explore some specific historical events that would further complicate your survival mires, from the rigid travel restrictions of the Sankin Kosai system to the devastating famines that periodically struck Japan during the Edo period. We'll also look at how seasonal challenges throughout the year would test different aspects of your modern adaptations, from summer diseases to winter food scarcity. We'll examine the limited options that might be available to you for improving your situation, from religious institutions to the entertainment districts of major cities, each with their own dangers and limitations. And we'll consider what knowledge from the modern world might actually prove useful rather than dangerous in this setting. For now, reflect on the profound alienation you would experience in a world where everything familiar has been stripped away, replaced by complex systems of meaning and behavior that others navigate instinctively but remain largely invisible to you. Where every interaction carries potential danger, every task reveals your incompetence, and the burden of constantly performing unfamiliar social roles would exhaust your mental and emotional resources daily. As we continue our exploration of why you wouldn't survive in feudal Japan, let's examine specific historical events systems, and seasonal challenges that would further complicate your already precarious situation. Understanding these elements provides a more complete picture of the environment you'd be struggling to navigate. Let's begin with a critical system that shaped the entire structure of Edo Period Japan, Sankin Kosai, or the alternate attendance system. Implemented by the Tokugawa Shogunate, this ingenious political control mechanism required daimyo feudal lords to maintain two residences, one in their home domain and another in Edo, and to alternate between them, typically spending every other year in the capital. When lords returned to their domains, they were required to leave their wives and heirs in Edo as essentially political hostages. This system had profound implications for travel, security, and social control throughout Japan. The regular processions of daimyo and their retinues traveling to and from Edo necessitated an extensive network of official roads, post stations, and checkpoints. These checkpoints, seksho, were designed specifically to control movement throughout the country, with particular attention to preventing weapons from entering Edo and political hostages from leaving it. For you as a displaced modern person, these checkpoints would present a nearly insurmountable barrier to travel. Each checkpoint required travelers to present official documentation, including travel permits, identification papers, and certificates stating their purpose and destination. Without these documents, you simply could not pass legally. The penalties for attempting to circumvent checkpoints were severe, often including execution. This restricted movement had a profound impact on Japanese society, effectively dividing the country into semi-isolated regions. Despite nominal unification under the Tokugawa Shogunate, local dialects, customs, and even cooking styles diverged significantly between regions. If you somehow managed to travel between regions, you would find yourself facing new cultural barriers, even if you had begun to adapt to local customs in one area. The alternate attendance system also created a massive economic burden, as daimyo were required to maintain large entourages during their travels and support two separate households. These expenses were ultimately borne by the peasant class through heavy taxation, contributing to the economic precarity that regularly resulted in famines and peasant uprisings. Speaking of famines, these regular catastrophes would present perhaps the most immediate threat to your survival after disease. The Edo period saw several devastating famines that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The Tenmei famine 1782 to 1788, for example, resulted from a combination of crop failures due to cold weather, flooding, and volcanic eruptions, eventually killing over 900,000 people, about 1/8 of the population in some regions. During such times, the rigid social structures of normal life could break down in desperate ways. Historical records document cases of infanticide, abandonment of elderly family members, and even cannibalism during the worst famines. The government response to these crises was often inadequate, focused more on maintaining order than providing relief. As an outsider, without established community ties or knowledge of emergency wild food sources, your chances of surviving a famine would be essentially zero. Even in years without outright famine, the period known as the Hungry Gap was a regular seasonal challenge. This occurred during late winter and early spring, when the previous year's stored food began to run out, but new crops were not yet ready for harvest. During these times, peasant families often subsisted on reduced rations, foraged plants, some with minimal nutritional value, and sometimes hunger foods made from things not normally considered edible, such as bark and roots. Modern nutritional science recognizes that such periods of regular food insecurity have cumulative health impacts, particularly on developing children. Your body, accustomed to consistent nutrition, would struggle to adapt to these cyclical periods of scarcity. Moreover, without the traditional knowledge of which wild plants were safe to eat and how to prepare them, Your foraging attempts might lead to poisoning rather than sustenance. Seasonal weather patterns presented their own challenges beyond their impact on food supply. Japan's climate varies significantly by region, but much of the country experiences hot, humid summers and cold winters, with significant rainfall year-round. The rainy season, Suyu, typically arrives in June and lasts for weeks, bringing constant dampness that caused respiratory illnesses, skin infections, and damage to homes and possessions. Without modern weatherproofing, mold and mildew would infest clothing, bedding, and stored foods during this season. Summer brought intense heat and humidity, particularly challenging in urban environments like Edo. Without air conditioning, electric fans, or even ice for cooling, heat-related illnesses were common. The traditional architectural response, highly ventilated buildings with removable wall panels, helped somewhat but also allowed easy entry for mosquitoes, carrying diseases like Japanese encephalitis and malaria. Typhoons regularly struck Japan during late summer and early autumn, causing widespread destruction. The traditional wooden architecture, while somewhat flexible during earthquakes, was highly vulnerable to these powerful storms. Flooding from typhoon rains could destroy rice fields just before harvest, leading to food shortages in the following year. Winter brought its own challenges, particularly in northern regions. Traditional heating relied on small charcoal braziers, hibachi, that provided minimal warmth, while creating risk of fire and carbon monoxide poisoning in the poorly ventilated spaces. In mountain villages, heavy snowfall could isolate communities for weeks or months. Many rural homes were designed with steep thatched roofs to prevent snow accumulation, but these required regular maintenance and still occasionally collapsed under extreme snow loads. These seasonal challenges necessitated specific knowledge and practices that were passed down through generations. When to repair the roof before typhoon season, how to preserve foods for winter, which medicinal plants to gather in which season. Without this accumulated wisdom, you would be constantly caught unprepared for seasonal changes that locals anticipated and planned for months in advance. Beyond seasons and natural disasters, political events could also dramatically impact your survival chances. Peasant uprisings occurred throughout the Edo period, often in response to famine, excessive taxation, or abuses by local officials. The largest, such as the Shimabara Rebellion, 1637 to 1638, resulted in massive casualties. Approximately 37,000 rebels and civilians were killed during its suppression. The shogunate's response to such uprisings was typically swift and brutal, with punishment often extending to entire villages associated with rebels. If you found yourself in an area experiencing such unrest, you would face danger from both sides of the conflict. Desperate rebels might force you to join them, or kill you as a potential informant, while government forces might assume your foreignness indicated involvement with the rebellion. Even expressing sympathy for suffering peasants could be interpreted as supporting sedition against the established order. Urban areas were not immune to social unrest either. Rice riots occurred periodically in cities when prices rose beyond what common people could afford. These sometimes escalated into attacks on wealthy merchants believed to be hoarding rice for profit. Again, as an obvious outsider, you might become a convenient target during such chaotic events. Let's consider some specific aspects of daily life we haven't yet explored in detail, starting with access to information. The Edo period saw remarkable growth in literacy and publishing despite government censorship, with a flourishing culture of books, ukiyo prints, and broadsheets. However, the information available was tightly controlled, with strict censorship of potentially subversive ideas. Without ability to read classical Japanese, you would be cut off from even this limited information stream. Verbal news and rumors spread through tea houses, public baths, and markets, but understanding these would require both language fluency and cultural context you would lack. This information isolation would leave you constantly a step behind in understanding events that might affect your survival. Speaking of language, let's delve deeper into why communication would remain challenging, even if you somehow learn to speak some Japanese. The language used in Edo Period Japan differed significantly from modern Japanese in vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and usage patterns. Multiple regional dialects existed, some so distinct they were mutually unintelligible. More importantly, the language was deeply encoded with status markers and honorific levels that native speakers navigated instinctively, but would be nearly impossible for an outsider to master quickly. Using the wrong level of honorific speech could range from merely embarrassing to actively dangerous, depending on the context and the status of the person you were addressing. Additionally, indirect communication was highly valued, the ability to suggest rather than state directly, to understand what was meant beyond what was said. These nuances would likely remain beyond your grasp even after years of immersion. Now let's examine some specific venues that might initially seem like potential havens for an outsider, and why each would ultimately prove problematic. Religious institutions might appear to offer sanctuary. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines were important social centers, and Buddhist doctrine in particular emphasized compassion. However, religious institutions were also deeply integrated into the political control system of Tokugawa Japan. Buddhist temples maintained population registers that functioned as a census and verification system, particularly focused on identifying hidden Christians who faced severe persecution. To receive long-term assistance from a temple, you would need to demonstrate appropriate religious knowledge and commitment. Your strange background and likely ignorance of proper religious practices would generate suspicion. While you might receive temporary charity, sustainable support would require integration into religious structures that would quickly identify your unusual background. What about joining the entertainment districts that existed in larger cities? Areas like the Yoshiwara in Edo created spaces where normal social rules were somewhat relaxed, allowing for more fluid interactions. However, these districts operated under their own complex hierarchies and rule systems. The floating world of entertainment had its own strict codes of behavior, specialized language, and expected knowledge that would be equally foreign to you. Moreover, entertainment districts were closely monitored by authorities precisely because they represented potential spaces for subversion. Your strange mannerisms and speech would attract even more attention in these environments. For women, the primary opportunity in such districts would be various forms of sex work. Highly regulated, often exploitative, and frequently inescapable once entered. What about rural hermitages or mountain communities? The mountains of Japan did contain small settlements, religious retreats, and occasionally hidden communities of persecuted groups like Christians. However, these isolated communities were typically even more suspicious of outsiders than mainstream society, having retreated specifically to maintain their independence or safety. Without valuable skills or connections, you would likely be turned away or reported to authorities rather than welcomed. Let's consider a possibility we haven't addressed yet. What if you tried to reveal your true origins? Might your strange knowledge and obviously foreign ways be better explained by admitting you're from the future or another place? This approach would almost certainly backfire catastrophically. In the worldview of Edo Japan, your claim would likely be interpreted through the lens of spiritual possession, mental instability, or deliberate deception, none of which would improve your situation. The concept of time travel or dimensional shifting simply had no place in the cosmology of the period. At best, you'd be viewed as insane, at worst as possessed by evil spirits or deliberately spreading dangerous falsehoods. Claims about future technology or events would similarly find no purchase without demonstrable proof, which you would lack. Predictions that eventually proved true might temporarily increase your perceived spiritual power, but would more likely result in fear and potential accusations of practicing dangerous magic. Let's examine the specific challenges you'd face if you were categorized into different social classes. If somehow accepted as a peasant, you would face backbreaking agricultural labor from dawn to dusk, with techniques your body isn't conditioned for. Tax burdens would take 40 to 60% of your production, leaving barely enough to survive. Your lack of traditional agricultural knowledge would mark you as incompetent, jeopardizing not just your standing but potentially the entire village's food supply and tax obligations. Villages operated on collective responsibility. If you failed to contribute properly, everyone suffered. If working as an artisan's apprentice, traditional crafts required years of careful observation and practice before even basic competence was achieved. Masters rarely explained techniques explicitly, expecting apprentices to learn by watching and doing. Physical punishment for mistakes was normal and accepted. Your modern expectations of explicit instruction, reasonable working hours, and personal rights would clash disastrously with this environment. Additionally, most crafts involved techniques refined over generations that relied on tacit knowledge, subtle physical cues impossible to convey verbally that you would lack. If somehow placed in merchant class, while potentially less physically demanding, merchant activities required extensive knowledge of established business networks, credit arrangements, and pricing conventions. Without family connections or a patron, establishing yourself in commerce would be nearly impossible. Moreover, merchant activities were heavily regulated by guilds that restricted entry and enforced compliance with established practices. Your ignorance of these unwritten rules would prevent successful integration. If employed as a servant, household service required intimate knowledge of proper etiquette, cleaning techniques, food preparation, and the specific preferences of the household. Servants were expected to anticipate needs before they were expressed and perform tasks perfectly with minimal instruction. Your inevitable missteps would likely result in dismissal at best, punishment at worst. What about opportunities that might seem more aligned with modern skills, such as teaching or advisory roles? Unfortunately, education in Edo Japan followed strict traditional models focused on classical texts, calligraphy, martial arts, and established philosophical traditions. Without mastery of these classical foundations, you would not be qualified to teach by period standards, regardless of your modern knowledge. Advisory positions to wealthy merchants or daimyo would be similarly unattainable without established credentials and proper introductions. The rigid social hierarchy meant that access to people of influence required proper lineage, formal recommendations, and recognized status. Cold calling or self-promotion would be seen as presumptuous and inappropriate. Let's examine another aspect of life in feudal Japan that would prove challenging: sleep and rest. Modern people are accustomed to private sleeping spaces, comfortable bedding, and the ability to maintain preferred sleeping schedules. In Edo, Japan, sleeping arrangements were communal in most households, with family members sharing a single room separated only by thin partitions, if at all. Bedding consisted of futon mattresses placed directly on the tatami floor, much thinner than modern mattresses, with wooden blocks or rice-filled pillows that most modern people would find uncomfortable. Sleeping position was important. Pointing your feet toward the household altar or the direction of the imperial palace in Edo was considered disrespectful. Sleep schedules followed natural light rather than fixed hours, with most people rising at dawn and retiring shortly after sunset, adjusted seasonally. The concept of staying up late by choice would seem bizarre and wasteful of precious lamp oil. Your modern sleep preferences and potential difficulty adapting to traditional bedding would result in chronic sleep deprivation, further reducing your adaptive capacity. Let's also consider the psychological impact of constant surveillance that characterized feudal Japanese society. The system of collective responsibility meant that everyone monitored everyone else out of self-preservation. Villages employed formal rotation systems for neighborhood watching, while urban areas had designated ward bosses who reported unusual activities to authorities. This constant observation extended into households where multiple generations lived together in relatively open spaces. The concept of privacy as understood in modern terms simply didn't exist. Your activities, conversations, and potentially even thoughts would be subject to scrutiny and commentary from those around you. This surveillance wasn't just a governmental function but a social one, with community members enforcing conformity through observation and gossip. For a modern person accustomed to privacy and individual autonomy, this environment would create significant psychological stress. The feeling of being constantly watched and judged would likely trigger anxiety, paranoia, and emotional withdrawal, further marking you as strange and potentially dangerous in local eyes. Let's talk about currency and economic transactions, which would present another layer of challenge. The Edo period used a complex system of multiple currencies simultaneously: gold, koban, and rye for large transactions, silver for middle value exchanges, and copper mon for everyday purchases. Different domains sometimes issued their own currency, and exchange rates fluctuated. Without understanding this system, you would be easily cheated in transactions, or might unwittingly try to use currency not accepted in a particular region. More importantly, many economic interactions weren't strictly monetized but operated through complex systems of credit, obligation, and barter, particularly in rural areas. Merchants extended credit based on family reputation and standing, not individual creditworthiness as in modern systems. Without established family connections, you would find it nearly impossible to participate in these informal economic networks essential for survival during hard times. The concept of land ownership differed fundamentally from modern understanding as well. While technically the shogun owned all land, usage rights were allocated through complex systems of traditional claims, hereditary assignments, and local agreements. Peasants couldn't simply buy or sell the land they farmed, but were bound to it through obligations to their lord. Without a recognized place in this system, you would have no legitimate means to acquire land use rights. Let's consider the challenges of simply maintaining personal appearance appropriate to the period. Hairstyles were strictly regulated by class and gender, with specific styles mandatory for certain statuses. Men typically wore the chanmage style with pate shaved and remaining hair oiled and tied in a top knot. Women's hairstyles were even more elaborate and status-specific, requiring special tools and often assistance to maintain properly. Clothing wasn't simply a matter of personal preference, but indicated precise information about social status, occupation, age, marital status, and sometimes even political affiliation. Wearing clothing inappropriate to your station wasn't just a fashion faux pas, but could be considered actively deceptive and potentially illegal. The sumptuary laws of the Tokugawa Shogunate specifically regulated which classes could wear which fabrics, colors, and styles. Personal grooming extended beyond appearance to subtle olfactory expectations. Certain scents were associated with specific classes and occupations. The smell of rice fields and agricultural work was expected of farmers, while merchants might use specific incense or oils. Your modern hygiene practices, or lack thereof by local standards, would create another layer of wrongness that locals would detect immediately. Let's examine the nature of social relationships, which differed fundamentally from modern patterns. In contemporary society, we generally choose our associates based on common interests, compatible personalities, or mutual benefit. In feudal Japan, most social relationships were predetermined by birth, geographic proximity, and occupational category. The concept of friendship as we understand it, voluntary association based on personal affinity, existed, but was subordinated to obligatory social relationships. The idea of forming connections outside your assigned social sphere would seem suspicious and potentially subversive. Cross-class friendships were particularly unusual, and might attract unwanted attention. Your natural tendency to seek out like-minded individuals, rather than accepting assigned social connections, would mark you as failing to understand proper social boundaries. Let's consider a specific example that illuminates the profound difference in worldview: reactions to illness and misfortune. In modern society, we typically view disease as a random biological event, requiring medical intervention. In Edo, Japan, illness was often interpreted through moral and spiritual frameworks as punishment for improper behavior, the result of spirit possession, or karmic consequence of past actions. If you became ill and responded with modern expectations, seeking specific treatments, expecting sympathy without spiritual interpretation, your behavior would seem inappropriate and potentially offensive. Your failure to consider the spiritual dimensions of illness, perform proper purification rituals, or acknowledge potential moral failings would mark you as spiritually ignorant at best, arrogantly dismissive of important cultural beliefs at worst. This extends to how you would conceptualize and discuss misfortune generally. The Buddhist-influenced worldview prevalent in Edo, Japan, emphasized acceptance of suffering as an inherent part of existence. Complaining excessively about hardship or expressing entitlement to better conditions would be seen as demonstrating poor character and spiritual immaturity. Your modern expectation that problems should and can be fixed would clash with the more fatalistic acceptance often expected in traditional Japanese society. Let's address another potential scenario. What if you tried to leverage historical knowledge to your advantage? Perhaps you know about future events, political developments, or economic opportunities that might seem valuable to local powers. This approach would be fraught with danger. First, your knowledge of Japanese history would likely be too general to provide actionable intelligence without raising suspicion about your sources. Predicting a major earthquake might seem impressive, but without specific dates, the prediction would be useless. With specific dates, it would seem impossibly precise, without divine or mystical explanation. Second, involving yourself in politics in any way would increase scrutiny of your background and identity, exactly what you'd want to avoid. The political system of the Tokugawa Shogunate was designed to identify and neutralize potential threats to stability. Your unusual knowledge combined with your strange background would more likely mark you as a dangerous agent than a valuable advisor. Finally, historical events you learned about in modern education were often simplified and sometimes inaccurately portrayed. Attempting to navigate complex local politics with incomplete or incorrect information could lead to catastrophic missteps. What about technology? Surely some simple innovations from the modern world could be reproduced and might improve your standing. This too would likely backfire. The Tokugawa Shogunate was explicitly conservative, having witnessed how firearms and other foreign technologies disrupted Japanese society prior to the isolation period. Technological innovation wasn't universally welcomed, but carefully controlled, with potentially disruptive technologies actively suppressed. Attempting to introduce innovations might brand you as a dangerous foreign influence. Even if your innovations were accepted, without patent protection or concept of intellectual property as we understand it, you would likely receive little benefit once your idea was absorbed by established craft guilds or merchant houses with the resources to implement it at scale. Let's consider what would happen if you became seriously ill or injured, a likely scenario given the numerous hazards we've discussed. Modern people are accustomed to professional medical care, pain management, and relatively effective treatments for many conditions. In Edo, Japan, your options would be dramatically different. Professional medical practitioners existed but operated primarily under Chinese-influenced medical theories. Treatment would likely involve restoration of balance rather than targeting specific pathogens or conditions as understood by modern medicine. Herbal remedies, acupuncture, moxibustion, and bloodletting were common approaches, with varying degrees of effectiveness for different conditions. Pain management was particularly limited. Opium was known but tightly restricted and not commonly used medicinally. Most pain relief relied on herbal preparations with mild analgesic properties, nothing approaching the effectiveness of modern pain medications. Surgical procedures, when performed, would be done without effective anesthesia. Many modern people would find even routine medical treatments of the period traumatic and potentially worse than the conditions they aim to treat. Without family or established community connections, you might struggle to receive even these limited treatments. Medical care was not considered a universal right, but often depended on social status, ability to pay, or family connections to a particular healer. As an outsider, you might be viewed with suspicion by medical practitioners or charged exorbitant rates for basic treatments. Let's explore one additional scenario. What if you attempted to reach one of the few points of foreign contact permitted during the isolation period? During most of the Edo period, the only official foreign presence was the Dutch trading post at Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, a tiny artificial island where a small number of Dutch merchants were permitted to conduct limited trade under strict supervision. The journey to Nagasaki from anywhere in Japan would be extraordinarily difficult without proper travel documents, requiring you to somehow circumvent multiple checkpoints on official roads or attempt dangerous travel through mountainous terrain. If caught traveling without authorization, you would face severe punishment. Even if you somehow reached Nagasaki, access to Dejima was tightly controlled. You couldn't simply walk onto the island and introduce yourself to the Dutch. Japanese authorities carefully selected and monitored all interactions between the Dutch traders and Japanese citizens. Attempting to make unauthorized contact would likely result in immediate arrest. Moreover, even if you somehow managed to speak with the Dutch traders, they would have strong incentives not to help you. Their profitable trading position depended entirely on maintaining good relations with Japanese authorities and following all regulations scrupulously. Assisting a mysterious foreigner would jeopardize their entire operation. Historical records show that when shipwrecked foreign sailors occasionally made it to Dejima seeking help, the Dutch often had no choice but to turn them over to Japanese authorities. Let's also consider a fundamental practical challenge: money. Modern people are accustomed to exchanging labor for wages, using standardized currency, and having legal recognition of their right to participate in economic activity. In feudal Japan, economic participation was tightly bound to social position and family membership. Without established identity documents or family registration, you would have no legal standing to engage in commerce, own property, or enter into contracts. Most forms of employment required formal apprenticeship or family connection. Day labor existed, but was generally reserved for the lowest classes and provided bare subsistence at best. Without documentation, you might not even be able to legally handle currency in some contexts. Moreover, the concept of making a living as an independent individual was foreign to Edo Period Japan. Economic activity was understood as a family or household matter, not an individual pursuit. Without integration into a household economic unit, you would remain perpetually marginalized economically, regardless of what skills or knowledge you possessed. As we prepare to move to our next section, it's worth reflecting on the fundamental incompatibility between modern consciousness and the feudal Japanese worldview. The experience wouldn't just be physically challenging, but would require a complete restructuring of your basic assumptions about reality, human relations, and your own identity. The concept of the autonomous individual with inherent rights, the expectation of personal choice in major life decisions, the separation of religious belief from social obligation, the voluntary nature of personal affiliations, all these fundamentally modern ideas would need to be unlearned to function effectively in this environment. More than physical survival, This cognitive and identity adjustment might be the most insurmountable barrier to adaptation. In our next section, we'll explore some of the specific ways feudal Japanese culture conceptualized the human mind and identity differently from modern understanding. We'll examine concepts like kokoro, heart-mind, negative space, kata, form, and other cultural frameworks that shaped perception and behavior in ways alien to contemporary thinking. We'll also look at specific professional domains and their specialized knowledge, from the tea ceremony to martial arts, that encoded cultural values through physical practice rather than explicit instruction. We'll also examine the unique dangers faced by women, children, and the elderly in this society, and how these vulnerabilities would be magnified for someone without proper social integration. And we'll consider whether there might be any specific historical moments or social contexts during the Edo period that might offer slightly better chances of survival, however marginal. For now, consider how profoundly disorienting it would be to find yourself in a world where almost everyone shares assumptions you don't understand, follows rules you can't see, and interprets your most basic behaviors in ways you never intended, where your fundamental understanding of cause and effect, social interaction, and even your own identity are radically misaligned with the society around you. As we continue exploring why modern humans couldn't survive in feudal Japan, let's examine the deeper cultural concepts and cognitive frameworks that would make true adaptation nearly impossible. Beyond the practical challenges we've discussed lies a more fundamental barrier: the profound difference in how human consciousness itself was understood and experienced. Let's begin with some core Japanese cultural concepts that would shape every interaction, but remain largely invisible to you until you violated them. The concept of kokoro, humans, is often translated simply as heart or mind, but in feudal Japan, it represented something more holistic: the integration of emotion, intellect, spirit, and moral character. While modern Western thought tends to separate reason from emotion, body from mind, Japanese cultural tradition viewed these as inseparably connected. Your modern tendency to articulate thoughts as distinct from feelings would seem artificial and potentially deceptive to Edo Period Japanese, who would expect natural harmony between inner state and outer expression. This ties directly to the concept of makoto, makote, often translated as sincerity or authenticity, but carrying deeper connotations of perfect alignment between inner intention and outer action. Modern psychological frameworks that acknowledge the complexity and sometimes contradictory nature of human motivation would seem like moral failing rather than self-awareness in this context. The expectation wasn't just to behave properly, but to genuinely feel appropriate emotions in each situation, something that cannot be faked through compliance alone. The concept of makote, the meaningful space or interval between things, shaped everything from architecture to conversation patterns. Unlike modern communication that often seeks to fill silence and be explicit, traditional Japanese interaction valued the pregnant pause, the unspoken implication, the space between words where meaning truly resided. Your likely tendency toward verbal directness would be perceived not as refreshing honesty, but as crude lack of refinement. This extends to the principle of hierarchy, forgi, makote, literally belly art, referring to wordless communication through intuitive understanding rather than explicit statement. In professional and social contexts, the highest form of communication occurred when words became almost unnecessary, with subtle cues conveying complex meanings. Your inability to participate in this implicit communication would exclude you from deeper levels of interaction, regardless of language proficiency. The concept of giri we mentioned earlier deserves deeper exploration. Often translated simply as duty or obligation, giri represented the complex web of social debts and responsibilities that bound Japanese society together. Unlike modern contractual obligations with clear terms and endpoints, Giri obligations were often unspoken, without defined limits, and accumulated throughout life. Your modern framework for understanding interpersonal obligations would leave you constantly misreading what was expected of you and by whom. Related to this is the obligation created when one receives a favor or benefit from another. In feudal Japan, receiving help created a debt that required acknowledgement and repayment, often with interest. The modern casual thanks for assistance would seem grossly insufficient. More problematically, not recognizing when you'd received would mark you as socially inept or ungrateful, creating tensions you wouldn't even perceive until they damaged your relationships. The concept of kata, Doseni, often translated as form one, thus structured everything from martial arts to tea ceremony to daily greetings. Unlike modern emphasis on personal expression and innovation, traditional Japanese culture valued perfection in executing established patterns. These forms weren't considered limitations but vehicles for expressing deeper understanding through subtle perfection of predetermined movements. Your likely modern resistance to seemingly arbitrary formalities would prevent you from accessing the deeper cultural meanings embedded within these patterns. These cultural concepts weren't abstract philosophical ideas but embodied practices that shaped perception and behavior at a level preceding conscious thought. They represented not just beliefs that could be intellectually understood, but foundational frameworks that structured reality itself differently than your modern consciousness is organized to perceive. Let's examine how these differences would play out in specific domains. In social hierarchy, the concept of Meikote, often translated as place, but meaning social context, determined appropriate behavior in each situation. Every interaction occurred within a specific bay that established proper roles, language, and expectations. Modern people often maintain relatively consistent personal identity across contexts, but traditional Japanese social functioning required adopting almost different personas depending on the specific bay. Meikote, appropriate with drinking companions, would be completely different from interaction with family elders or professional contacts. Your likely struggle to read these contextual shifts would make your behavior seem erratic and inappropriate. In aesthetics, the principle of wabi-sabi, Diote, Meikote, finding beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Meikote contrasts sharply with modern preferences for symmetry, permanence, and completion. The traditional Japanese aesthetic sensibility valued subtle suggestion over bold statement, natural patination over pristine newness, simplicity over elaboration. Your modern aesthetic preferences would likely lead you to misrecognize quality and value, appreciating what locals considered gaudy, while missing the refined beauty in what might seem plain or unfinished to your eyes. In emotional expression, the concept of enrisote, iniro, Meikote, self-restraint or holding back. Meikote governed appropriate behavior. Unlike modern emphasis on emotional authenticity and expression, traditional Japanese culture highly valued emotional control and consideration of how one's expressions affected group harmony. Your likely modern tendency toward emotional transparency would seem childish and self-indulgent rather than authentic or honest. Now let's examine specific domains of specialized knowledge that would be closed to you despite their essential nature. Agricultural knowledge in feudal Japan wasn't just technical but embedded with spiritual significance and generational wisdom. Rice cultivation particularly involved complex understanding of local climate patterns, soil conditions, water management, and timing that couldn't be quickly learned from manuals or explanation. Farmers possessed inherited knowledge about their specific fields, which areas drained poorly, which sections needed more attention during drought, which plots were vulnerable to specific pests. Without this localized, embodied knowledge, your agricultural efforts would likely fail regardless of general farming principles you might understand. domestic skills included not just cooking and cleaning, but proper maintenance of specific materials unknown in the modern world. Paper walls, tatami mats, wooden structures without nails all required specialized maintenance techniques. Food preservation, without refrigeration, involved complex fermentation processes, smoking techniques, and curing methods that balanced preservation against spoilage in the specific Japanese climate. Your lack of these fundamental skills would render you dependent on others for basic subsistence. Craft knowledge was particularly embodied and rarely articulated explicitly. Traditional crafts relied on what modern cognitive science calls tacit knowledge, makote, understanding that cannot be fully communicated verbally, but must be acquired through physical practice and observation. A swordsmith's understanding of metal coloration during heating, a potter's sense of clay consistency, a carpenter's feel for wood grain. These crucial skills resided in the body more than the mind and required years of practice to develop. Your modern expectation of explicit instruction and rapid skill acquisition would clash with the traditional apprenticeship model that assumed lengthy observation before even attempting basic techniques. Medical and herbal knowledge combined empirical observation with cosmological frameworks entirely different from modern medicine. While some traditional remedies contained effective medicinal compounds, knowing which plants to gather, when to harvest them, and how to prepare them required extensive local knowledge. More importantly, the diagnostic framework for identifying illnesses bore little resemblance to modern classification of diseases. Without understanding how symptoms were categorized and interpreted in traditional medicine, you would struggle to explain your ailments in terms healers could meaningfully interpret. Now let's examine the particular vulnerabilities of specific demographic groups and how these would apply to your situation. For women, the Confucian principle of three obediences structured expectations throughout life: obedience to father before marriage, husband during marriage, and son in widowhood. While the practical application varied somewhat by class and region, women's lives were generally much more constrained than in modern society. A modern woman transported to Edo, Japan, would find herself caught in an impossible situation, lacking the training to perform expected female roles properly, yet denied access to traditionally male domains. Even basic body language and speech patterns were strictly gendered, with feminine movements and language patterns ingrained from childhood. Without these embodied feminine behaviors, a modern woman would appear bizarre and potentially threatening to the social order. For modern men, different challenges would arise. Masculine identity in feudal Japan was tightly bound to clear role fulfillment, hierarchical position, and specific behaviors, signaling proper gender performance. Physical markers of masculinity differed as well. The idealized male body type was lean and wiry rather than heavily muscled, with specific posture and movement patterns considered appropriately masculine. Your likely different conception of manhood, from emotional expression to body language to expectations of male-female interactions, would mark you as fundamentally unmanly by local standards. For children, feudal Japan presented a paradoxical environment compared to modern childhood. In some ways, children faced harsher expectations, early participation in labor, stricter discipline, and less protection from adult realities like death, illness, and sexuality. Yet in other ways, particularly for young children, there was greater physical intimacy and integration into adult spaces rather than segregation into child-specific environments. A modern child or teenager transported to this environment would struggle with both the harsher expectations and the different conceptualization of childhood itself as a developmental stage. For the elderly, feudal Japan offered greater status and respect than in many modern contexts, but with specific expectations of appropriate elderly behavior and appearance. Older people were expected to gradually withdraw from physical labor while providing wisdom and guidance to younger generations. However, this respected position depended entirely on having established family connections and accumulated social standing throughout life. An elderly modern person without these connections would face particular difficulty, lacking both the physical stamina for labor roles and the established social position that would command respect and support. Let's examine certain historical periods or contexts that might offer marginally better chances for integration, though still with overwhelming challenges. The period of gradual opening that preceded the Meiji Restoration, roughly 1853 to 1868, saw increasing, though still highly controlled, foreign contact. During this time, some domains began cautiously exploring Western knowledge, particularly in medicine, military science, and technology. A modern person with specific technical expertise might find slightly more receptive audience during this period, though still facing enormous barriers to acceptance. Urban centers, particularly Edo, Osaka, and Nagasaki, maintained somewhat more cosmopolitan attitudes than rural areas, with greater exposure to diverse ideas and occasional interaction with foreign concepts. The merchant class in these cities developed more flexible social structures than the rigid hierarchies of samurai or peasant communities. However, urban areas also featured stronger government presence and surveillance, increasing the risk of official attention to unusual individuals. Some domains were historically more open to innovation than others. The Satsuma domain in southern Kyushu, for example, maintained unofficial foreign contacts despite the isolation edicts and showed interest in Western technology. Similarly, the Shoshu domain actively sought military modernization in the late Edo period. However, these domains were also particularly suspicious of potential spies or disruptive influences, subjecting strangers to intense scrutiny. Religious communities, particularly some Buddhist sects, occasionally provided refuge for social outcasts. The Shodo Shinji sect explicitly rejected social discrimination and sometimes sheltered individuals excluded from mainstream society. However, gaining acceptance into these communities still required convincing demonstrations of sincere religious commitment and appropriate behavior according to their specific doctrines. Let's consider another dimension that would complicate survival: the complex relationship between written and spoken language in feudal Japan. Even if you somehow managed to learn conversational Japanese, literacy would present entirely different challenges. The written language employed multiple scripts simultaneously: kanji Chinese characters, hiragana, and katakana, used in specific combinations depending on the text type, audience, and subject matter. Moreover, literary Japanese differed significantly from spoken language, employing classical grammatical structures and vocabulary distinct from everyday speech. Official documents used highly formalized language patterns that even educated Japanese people sometimes struggled to fully comprehend. Without literacy, you would be excluded from any position requiring documentation, record keeping, or written communication. Essentially all roles above manual labor. This linguistic complexity extended to names and forms of address, which carried significant social information. Japanese naming conventions indicated family relationships, social status, regional origin, and sometimes professional affiliation. Without understanding these conventions, you would constantly misaddress people, potentially causing serious offense in status-conscious interactions. Let's explore the psychological experience of time, which would differ markedly from modern temporal understanding. The Edo period used variable time units rather than fixed hours, dividing daylight and darkness each into 6 flexible periods that expanded or contracted seasonally with natural light. Clocks existed, but were expensive luxury items used differently than modern timepieces. More fundamentally, the cyclical conception of time based on agricultural seasons, religious observances, and natural phenomena, contrasted with the modern linear, progressive understanding of time. The Japanese calendar used a complex system of era names, zodiac cycles, and seasonal markers that structured experience differently than the Western calendar. Your internal sense of time niche, expecting fixed-length hours, 7-day weeks, and regular schedules, would constantly clash with local temporal rhythms. This extends to life cycle understanding as well. Age was calculated differently, with newborns considered 1 year old at birth, and everyone aging collectively at New Year rather than on individual birthdays. Life stages were marked by specific ceremonies and status changes often missing in modern society. Your likely expectation of continuous personal development and individualized life trajectory would contrast with the more standardized life course assumed in traditional Japanese society. Let's also consider the sensory experience of feudal Japan, which would differ dramatically from your modern sensory environment. The soundscape would lack the constant mechanical background noise of modern life, making natural sounds more prominent, but also human-generated sounds more intrusive. The relative quiet of rural areas might seem peaceful initially, but disorienting over time for someone accustomed to constant ambient noise. The olfactory environment would present particular challenges. Without modern sewage systems, garbage collection, or personal hygiene products, urban areas particularly featured strong odors most modern people would find overwhelming. Yet the Japanese aesthetic tradition also included highly refined appreciation of subtle scents, with incense appreciation developed as a formal art kodo. Your likely insensitivity to these valued subtle fragrances, combined with revulsion at normal period odors, would mark you as both crude and overly sensitive simultaneously. The visual environment would lack the standardized, mass-produced uniformity of modern spaces. Handcrafted objects meant subtle variations rather than identical items. Artificial lighting was limited to candles and oil lamps, creating a fundamentally different relationship with darkness. Night truly meant darkness in a way few modern people have experienced, with activities severely limited after sunset and fear of night as a dangerous time deeply ingrained in cultural consciousness. The tactile experience would feature natural materials, wood, paper, straw, clay, fabric, rather than modern plastics, synthetics, and metals. These materials responded to touch and environmental conditions differently, expanding and contracting with humidity, showing wear patterns with use, requiring specific maintenance. Your likely unfamiliarity with proper care of these materials would result in damage to items others maintained effortlessly through ingrained habits. Let's examine the concept of personal identity itself, which differed fundamentally from modern understanding. Contemporary Western societies generally view identity as internally generated, relatively stable across contexts, and centered on individual psychological continuity. In contrast, traditional Japanese conception viewed identity as primarily relational, defined by one's position within social networks rather than internal psychological states. The concept of jibun, tifun, tifin, literally self-part, reveals this different understanding, suggesting the self exists as a portion of larger social units rather than as an independent entity. Personal decisions, from career to marriage, were family matters rather than individual choices. The modern psychological need for self-actualization and personal authenticity would find little social support in a system where role fulfillment and group harmony took precedence over individual expression. This extends to emotional life as well. While modern psychology generally values emotional awareness and appropriate expression, traditional Japanese emotional ideals emphasized control, contextual appropriateness, and consideration of impact on others above personal emotional authenticity. Emotions were not simply internal states to be acknowledged. but proper or improper responses to social situations. Your likely different emotional responses and expressions would repeatedly mark you as socially inappropriate in ways difficult to self-monitor. The concept of moral responsibility also differed significantly. Modern ethical frameworks tend to emphasize individual intention and action, while traditional Japanese ethics emphasized outcomes and impacts on group harmony, regardless of personal intent. The modern defense of "I didn't mean to" would carry little weight in a system where causing disruption, regardless of intention, created moral culpability. This different moral framework would leave you constantly vulnerable to being judged harshly for actions you didn't recognize as problematic. Now let's examine some specific professional domains that might initially seem promising, but would ultimately prove inaccessible. Military service might appear viable for physically capable men, as armies periodically recruited during times of conflict. However, martial training in feudal Japan began in childhood, with specific physical disciplines developing bodies differently than modern exercise. More importantly, the martial arts were not merely fighting techniques, but embodied philosophical and spiritual practices, requiring years of cultural integration to master. Without proper formal introduction and sponsorship, attempting to join martial organizations would be impossible. Teaching might seem appropriate for educated modern people, but education in feudal Japan focused primarily on calligraphy, classical Chinese texts, martial arts, and established philosophical traditions. Teachers required formal credentials through recognized lineages of instruction. Without mastery of these classical foundations and proper certification, you would not be considered qualified regardless of modern knowledge. Entertainment professions occasionally allowed more social mobility and flexibility, but these too required specific training from young ages. Musicians needed years of training in traditional instruments, unlike modern ones, with playing techniques and musical theory entirely different from Western traditions. Theatrical performers underwent rigorous apprenticeships in highly stylized forms like no or kabuki, with precise physical techniques impossible to quickly imitate convincingly. Medicine might appear promising, particularly with some modern knowledge of anatomy or disease. However, traditional medical practice required formal apprenticeship and certification. More importantly, it operated under entirely different theoretical frameworks. Attempting to introduce modern medical concepts without the vocabulary or conceptual foundations to explain them would likely result in being labeled a dangerous quack rather than an innovative healer. The psychological impact of your situation would be profound and potentially debilitating. Modern psychology recognizes several conditions that would likely affect you. Culture shock, the disorientation from immersion in an unfamiliar culture, typically progresses through predictable stages, from initial fascination to frustration, adjustment, and eventual adaptation. However, the extreme difference between modern consciousness and Edo Period Japan would potentially create a permanent state of disorientation without progression to later stages of adaptation. Social isolation has demonstrated severe negative effects on mental and physical health. Without ability to connect meaningfully with others who share your basic worldview, chronic loneliness would likely lead to depression, anxiety, and potentially psychosomatic symptoms. Identity disruption occurs when fundamental aspects of self-concept are threatened or invalidated. Your core identity markers, profession, educational background, personal achievements, social circles would hold no meaning in feudal Japan. This ontological insecurity could trigger profound existential crisis and dissociative symptoms. Chronic stress from constant vigilance against cultural missteps, physical threats, and basic survival challenges would create elevated cortisol levels associated with numerous health problems, including compromised immune function, cardiovascular issues, and cognitive impairment. Trauma responses might develop from experiences of violence, disease, or extreme hardship commonplace in feudal Japan, but rare in modern developed nations. Without appropriate treatment or support systems, these could develop into conditions similar to PTSD, further compromising adaptive capacity. Let's also consider some fundamental philosophical differences that would create cognitive dissonance. The concept of natural rights, the modern belief that humans possess inherent rights by virtue of their humanity, would find no philosophical foundation in feudal Japanese thought. Rights and privileges were explicitly granted, based on social position, rather than considered inherent to human status. Your likely assumption of deserving certain treatments or considerations would constantly collide with a system that distributed rights exclusively according to hierarchical position. The concept of progress in the modern assumption that societies naturally improve over time through innovation and reform is contrasted sharply with the Tokugawa period's explicit valuation of stability and tradition over change. The Shogunate actively suppressed innovations that threatened established order. Your likely default assumption that newer equals better would mark you as dangerously destabilizing in a culture that prized maintaining traditional forms. The relationship to nature differed fundamentally as well. While modern industrialized societies generally view nature as a resource to be managed or an adversary to be controlled, traditional Japanese worldviews positioned humans as embedded within natural systems rather than separate from or superior to them. Nature wasn't wilderness to be conquered, but a complex system within which humans held particular responsibilities. Your likely modern attitudes toward environmental exploitation would conflict with local spiritual and practical approaches to natural resources. As we prepare to move to our final section, it's worth reflecting on perhaps the most fundamental barrier to survival means the lack of shared historical and cultural reference points that form the foundation of human connection. The stories, symbols, historical events, cultural heroes, and cautionary tales that structured meaning in feudal Japan would be largely unknown to you, while your own reference points would be meaningless to those around you. Humor, often considered a universal human connection point, relies heavily on shared context and expectations. Your attempts at humor would likely fall flat or cause offense, while local jokes and wordplay would remain opaque to you. Even simple references to folklore characters, historical events, or common sayings would create constant mutual incomprehension. This absence of shared meaning structures would make genuine connection nearly impossible at a level preceding practical challenges of language or social rules. Human relationships require some foundation of common understanding, and the gulf between your worldview and that of Edo period Japanese would rarely allow those connections to form beyond the most superficial interactions. In our final section, we'll explore whether there are any groups or individuals within feudal Japanese society who might be marginally more receptive to outsiders, examine how long even the most adaptable modern person might survive under optimal condition, and consider what this thought experiment reveals about both our modern condition and the nature of human cultural adaptation. We'll also explore what aspects of your modern knowledge and experience might actually prove valuable rather than dangerous, and whether there might be any silver linings to this otherwise dire scenario. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into why you couldn't survive in feudal Japan, let's consider a few final aspects of this thought experiment. Are there any groups within this society that might be marginally more accepting of an outsider? How long might even the most adaptable modern person survive under optimal conditions? And what, if anything, from your modern knowledge and experience might actually prove valuable rather than dangerous in this context? Let's begin with potential groups or individuals who might be slightly more receptive to your strange presence. Buddhist monks of certain sects, particularly those emphasizing universal compassion, might provide temporary shelter based on religious principles. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on direct experience over doctrinal conformity, might be marginally more accommodating of unusual individuals. However, even within these communities, you would eventually be expected to conform to monastic discipline and demonstrate sincere religious commitment, not merely seek refuge from society. The merchant class, particularly in major trading cities like Osaka, operated somewhat outside traditional Confucian values and occasionally demonstrated more pragmatic flexibility than other social classes. Some merchant houses engaged in limited foreign trade through authorized channels and might be marginally more curious about outside knowledge. However, merchants were also extremely risk-averse regarding potential government displeasure, making them unlikely to shelter someone who could attract negative official attention. Outcast communities, particularly the Burakumin formerly called Ita or Hinin, lived at society's margins, performing tasks considered ritually impure like butchery, leatherworking, and handling the dead. These communities developed parallel social structures, somewhat independent from mainstream society. While potentially more accepting of unusual individuals, integration would require willingness to adopt their stigmatized occupations and accept permanent residence at the lowest social position, with no possibility of upward mobility. Artists and performers occasionally achieved unique social positions that allowed greater eccentricity than would be tolerated in others. Particularly talented individuals sometimes received patronage that provided partial insulation from normal social expectations. However, achieving such status would require demonstrating extraordinary skill in traditional Japanese arts and something requiring years of proper training you wouldn't possess. Rural remote communities, particularly in mountainous regions or distant islands, sometimes develop distinct cultural patterns with slightly more flexibility than areas under direct shogunate control. However, these communities were often even more suspicious of outsiders precisely because of their isolation, and survival in harsh remote environments required specialized local knowledge developed over generations. Even among these relatively more receptive groups, acceptance would be conditional and limited. You would still need to demonstrate willingness to adapt to local expectations and contribute valuably to the community. No group would tolerate behavior that threatened community harmony or attracted dangerous official attention. Now let's consider how long even the most adaptable modern person might survive under optimal conditions, assuming you somehow found shelter, basic sustenance, and avoided immediate dangers. In the short-term first few weeks, physical survival would depend primarily on securing basic necessities while avoiding disease and violence. With extraordinary luck and perhaps compassionate assistance, you might manage this initial period, though suffering significant psychological distress and physical hardship. In the medium-term first few months, accumulated physical stress from unfamiliar diet, labor demands, exposure to pathogens, and psychological strain would likely manifest as health problems. Without developing functional communication skills and social connections during this period, longer-term integration would become increasingly unlikely. In the longer term beyond 6 months, sustained survival would require developing sufficient language ability, cultural understanding, and practical skills to secure stable position within the social order. The probability of achieving this level of adaptation would be vanishingly small, with countless opportunities for fatal missteps along the way. The historical record offers sobering insight through documented cases of actual foreigners in Japan during the isolation period. Even those with institutional support, interpreters, and official standing mice like the Dutch traders confined to Dejima Miser struggled enormously with cultural adaptation. Shipwrecked sailors who reached Japanese shores typically died from exposure, starvation, execution, or imprisonment rather than successfully integrating into society. One notable exception was William Adams, known in Japan as Miura Anjin, an English navigator who arrived in Japan in 1600, just before the strict isolation policies were fully implemented. Through extraordinary circumstances, including direct favor from the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, Adams achieved unique status and even became a samurai. However, his exceptional case occurred during a brief period of relative openness before isolation policies hardened, and required rare qualities of adaptability combined with valuable technical knowledge and immense luck. Even then, Adams never saw his home or family again. Let's consider what aspects of your modern knowledge and experience might actually prove valuable rather than dangerous in this context. Practical medical knowledge, if presented carefully and integrated with traditional frameworks, might occasionally prove useful. Basic understanding of hygiene, wound cleaning, or simple nutritional concepts could benefit a community if demonstrated rather than explained theoretically. However, this would require extraordinary sensitivity to avoid challenging traditional medical authorities or appearing to practice dangerous foreign techniques. Certain crafting or agricultural techniques might be adaptable to local conditions without seeming threateningly foreign. Knowledge of crop rotation, simple water filtration, or efficient use of materials could potentially be introduced gradually as personal practices rather than revolutionary innovations. Again, the key would be incremental demonstration without challenging established authorities or practices. Mathematical knowledge, particularly practical applications for construction, agriculture, or commerce, might be valued if you could translate modern concepts into terms compatible with traditional Japanese mathematics. The Japanese mathematical tradition was unsophisticated but used different methods and notation than Western mathematics, requiring significant translation of concepts. Perhaps most valuable would be psychological adaptability itself, needs of the capacity to observe closely, learn continuously, and adjust behavior accordingly, without rigid attachment to familiar patterns. Modern anthropologists develop these skills for fieldwork in unfamiliar cultures, but few modern people possess the extreme degree of adaptability required for this scenario. It's worth noting that any potentially valuable knowledge would need to be introduced with extraordinary cultural sensitivity, presented not as superior innovation, but as humble personal practice. Direct challenges to established methods or claims of superior knowledge would almost certainly backfire regardless of actual utility. As our exploration concludes, what broader insights might we draw from this thought experiment? First, it reveals the extraordinary depth of cultural context required for basic human functioning. Activities we consider natural or common sense are in fact deeply culturally constructed and historically specific. Our ability to navigate daily life depends on countless unexamined assumptions and shared understandings that become visible only when disrupted. Second, it illuminates both the remarkable adaptability and significant limitations of human consciousness. While humans have demonstrated extraordinary capacity to adapt to diverse cultural contexts, this adaptation typically occurs gradually through childhood socialization or through cultural transitions that maintain some continuity. The completely discontinuous transplantation we've imagined would likely exceed normal adaptive capacity. Third, it highlights the profound embeddedness of individual identity within social and cultural matrices. The modern conception of the autonomous individual exists not as a universal human condition, but as a specific historical development. In a society structured around fundamentally different understanding of personhood, modern individualism would become not just impractical but conceptually unintelligible. Finally, perhaps this thought experiment offers perspective on our own historical moment. Many aspects of contemporary life that we take for granted and differ from concepts of personal rights to expectations of physical comfort, from information access to healthcare, represent recent and historically unusual conditions rather than universal human norms. This recognition might foster both appreciation for specific positive aspects of modern life and humility regarding the contingent nature of our own cultural assumptions. The truth is, you almost certainly wouldn't survive a day in feudal Japan not because you lack personal resilience or intelligence, but because human consciousness itself is fundamentally shaped by historical and cultural context in ways far deeper than we typically recognize. The distance between your modern mind and the world of Edo Period Japan would likely be unbridgeable despite your best efforts, and And yet, perhaps there's something valuable in recognizing this unbridgeability and acknowledging the profound diversity of human experience across time and culture, and the remarkable adaptations each historical context has developed to address universal human needs for meaning, connection, and survival. In that recognition lies both humility about our own historical perspective and appreciation for the extraordinary diversity of ways humans have found to be human.